So expropriation has been a hot topic for a massive amount of years now. Recently, obviously, with the promulgation of the Act, the fear has set in, and those people that were still on the fence waiting for something to happen, obviously have now been the dawning of this act has now become real. And there's been an outcry by some people, and the act has been welcomed by other people. So my concern in the property space is how this act has affected confidence in the buying and selling of properties. Now, buying and selling of properties could mean a variety of different things, because we have residential properties, we have commercial properties, we have agricultural properties. So each of these properties has been impacted in one way or another. Now, obviously, a lot of this is anecdotal. So these are conversations that we have with estate agents, for example, that have had conversations with potential buyers who have shown a level of concern regarding the purchase of properties. Now, whether this can be statistically true is questionable. Obviously, I haven't, and there hasn't been time to conduct any studies on what this has done for confidence in the different property spaces. So again, this is anecdotal, but it's just conversations that we've picked up from people on the ground relating to sale of properties, and particularly in the space of residential properties. We have found that there's been fewer sales, definitely less interest. Now, it is the beginning of the year, so that could also be impacted by the fact that we're just coming off the back of January. But from some of the conversations, estate agents have indicated that people have told them that they're not looking to buy properties at the moment due to the uncertainty of what the Expropriation Act could mean for them. Now, whether this is long-lasting or not, I can't comment. I doubt it will be. As with most other acts in South Africa that have brought some level of despair or shock, this will, in all likeliness, tend to bubble down, and some people will learn to accept it, especially the more we converse over it and the more that we understand it. Now, maybe to have a conversation, shift the conversation from what the people are saying on the ground and what their fears are, to actually maybe addressing the fears themselves and whether these are reasonable fears, not reasonable fears, what they mean, what's being done about it, and what have the implications been on a national and international scale. Now, to begin with, I think it's very important to point out that expropriation comes as no secret to anyone. We as a society in South Africa have been having this conversation since the dawn of our constitution. Land redistribution has always been on the cards. It has not been a secret. It's not been a hidden agenda. It's always been around, right? Now, what this meant for people could differ. Maybe people had different understanding of it. And I'm finding this on both sides of the supporters and non-supporters, because some of the supporters understood land distribution as being a lot faster, as simply being the ability to maybe take land. And we've seen some political parties play on this emotion. Whereas on the other side of things, there was an expectation that expropriation would be dealt with in a fair basis with compensation, willing seller, willing buyer. And obviously that's also proven not to work, simply because willing seller, willing buyer does allow choices to be made, and sometimes those choices aren't necessarily in the public interest. So this act came into play to try and address that type of situation. And the public interest specifically is with a view to public interest. So the expropriation, and now the expropriation without compensation, all the terminology in that act is there, due to public interest. Public interest being the ability to take land and redistribute it. So land redistribution, public interest go hand in hand, because that is the intention of it. Now, since this is no surprise, we have to ask ourselves the question, how government intends to go about doing this and why the Act was introduced. Now, one of the issues with the Act, the Expropriation Act has always existed. It's always been an act that allowed government to take land in order to improve infrastructure, transport, railways, that sort of thing. That's always existed. It's never been. It's not new to South Africa. The difference with this particular act is it tries to speed up a process that was already in place. In the past, there was a level of negotiation, expropriation, and then determination of something like market value. Whereas now we speak about just and equitable, so that's in our constitution. We speak about compensation that is just and equitable, but that doesn't always necessarily mean market value. So that's something that people need to realize, is those two terms don't coincide with each other. Just and equitable is a court, for example, looking at the circumstances and coming to its own determination on what would be a just and equitable compensation. I'll get to this in a second. The reason why all of this is important is the Act came in to try and speed things along. Now, should we worry as homeowners, as an example, that this is something that's going to impact us? Well, it could impact us. For example, if there's conversations around infrastructure improvement and that sort of thing. Now, where we need to start having a conversation and trying to understand how this act is actually intended to function is when we start, and where the fear lies, is where people see that there's compensation, there's expropriation without compensation. And I think that's a trigger event, right? Because up until now, everything I've explained basically means that very little has changed. Even the just and equitable compensation, if you paid for the property and you've improved it and the property's increased in value and you've been patient with the property, it is often just and equitable that you be paid market value. But when we see the word no compensation or the term no compensation, we panic, because now we're looking at this going, oh, wow. So now let's forget just and equitable. Now we're looking at no compensation. First of all, the no compensation is still subjected to the just and equitable principle. So that's one thing that we need to bear in mind, is they are tied to each other. So it's not nil compensation under these examples and no one can say anything about it. It's still subjected to the test of just and equitable. And that test has been shown time and time again. We use that terminology across our laws in South Africa to test what is just, what is equitable on both sides, right? What's fair for government, what's fair for us as citizens. So that's the one thing to bear in mind. Also, the no compensation provision actually specifies a list of events that would be looked at when no compensation must be considered. Now, yes, as some of the viewers pointed out, this list is preceded by the words including, meaning that it's not exhaustive. It includes, but could include other things. But as soon as you see the word just and equitable, as soon as you see the word public interest, as soon as you see a list that gives an example of what would be considered to be public interest, then you start realizing that the scope isn't as broad as we would have feared, but it has become narrower and narrower as we interpret the legislation based on that terminology. And that terminology, for example, we've seen some of the examples on that list are abandoned buildings. Now, buildings that have been completely abandoned by the owner are derelict, sometimes in danger. We've seen CBD buildings in Joburg that fit this description to the T. There's certain properties that, for example, if given by government, where the person hasn't spent any money on the property and is now trying to sell it for a higher price, even though they didn't pay for the property and it was given by virtue of a grant. In those circumstances, it might be argued that the acquisition of the property was only done because of government, so government shouldn't have to pay compensation out to get it back. So there's certain very limited examples, and you'll see in some of my videos, I do touch on them. But there's limited examples where no compensation would apply. One thing to bear in mind is if we fear no compensation, there's limited circumstances where this will apply. If we fear expropriation as a whole, one needs to bear in mind that...
Sorry, Bruno, as you were just explaining, under which circumstances could it be possible that nil compensation will apply?
So it's those as an example. So it's abandoned buildings, buildings that obviously put people's lives at risks. Properties that were somehow where government was involved in the acquisition of a property and either offered some sort of grant or gave the property and now is trying to retrieve the property. And there's another one, for example, where a person's simply holding the land speculatively. So they're doing nothing with it. They're not doing any developments. It's not being used for any purposes, and it just sits there speculatively. So when you read between the lines of all, the list goes on. But when you read between the lines, what you tend to realize is this isn't supposed to allow for the expropriation of a commercial building that actually has a commercial enterprise, is making money, rental income, and they're going to this landlord and they're trying to take this building away. Nothing actually fits that criteria. It's the same as your home. No one is going to be knocking on your door trying to take your home without no compensation because it does not fall within this criteria. You're actually utilizing your home, you live there, or you're renting it out to a tenant. It does not fall within these examples. It does. One also has to ask, is it in the public interest and is it just and equitable? So there's a lot of tests or hurdles that have to be jumped over in order to be able to justify the acquisition of land without any compensation. So the next question people typically tend to ask me is, well, if that's the case and you're saying that we shouldn't be that worried. Look, like I said, expropriation is a real thing. It's always been a thing. So it's not to say the government won't one day knock on your door and ask you for your land for something, but that's not a new thing, and that's recognized.
I suppose just to come in here, like you said, that expropriation has always been an in thing, but the issue now is with regard to expropriation without compensation. So would I be correct to say our cycle must be very much careful to look into their property interests that they're looking to buy into, the circumstances surrounding it. Does that property belongs to government? Because in that case, I think it will go without saying that there's high possibility that a property could be expropriated without compensation. But is the property owned privately? Then in that case, what happens? Because I don't think it will be fair for the government to say, look, Bruno, you own this property privately, but we are expropriating it because we intend to do 1, 2, 3 in this particular location. So I think that's
so remember, it's got nothing to do with the owner. It's got nothing to do with the owner of the property. So if a person's buying property that happens to belong to government and they're paying money for this property, they're buying it. That's a normal sale. So there's no compensation when it deals with government. Not government properties, but properties as an example where the government had a part to play in the person receiving the property. So let's say, for example, the government gave the property to that person 10 years ago, 20 years ago, and now is asking for it back, right? And the person didn't pay anything for it. Or government gave a grant to allow that person to buy the property, and the person hasn't spent any extra money on the property, but is now trying to sell it back to government at a higher price, even though the grant covered the full purchase price of the property. So you're looking at examples where government partook or assisted or was associated with the acquisition of the property, not a situation where a person buys property from government, because that's the willing seller, willing buyer. As long as they're not getting a massive discount because for some reason or another, that is perfectly fine. Another null compensation example is the expropriation of land from government institutions that are holding this land, state-owned enterprises, that sort of thing. So these are very limited circumstances that apply to null compensation.